The grass along the riverbank had not changed in 30 years. It still grew in that particular shade of dull gold that appeared in the last weeks of a dying summer, and it still bent the same way in the same direction when the wind came down off the ridge, a slow, rolling surrender that looked almost choreographed, like the whole hillside had agreed to kneel together. Maren Voss noticed none of this. She was 14 years old and had more pressing concerns than the aesthetic preferences of grass. She was running, not the way children ran when they were late for dinner. That embarrassed half-trot that preserved at least the pretense of dignity. She was running the way people run. When something has gone wrong at a fundamental level, when the body decides that pride is a luxury it can no longer afford. Her boots struck the packed earth of the riverbank trail in an ugly burp, and her breath came out in hard white puffs that dissolved into the cold morning air before she'd even finished making them. Behind her, approximately 200 meters back in closing, came the reason she was running. She did not look back. She had learned, painful experience, that looking back was how you turned an almost escape into a confirmed disaster. Instead, she kept her eyes forward, fixed on the cluster of willows at the river, bend where the trail curved away from the bank and up toward the bridge road. If she made the willows, she made the road. If she made the road, she made the compound perimeter. If she made the perimeter, something hit her between the shoulder blades. A weapon, not a projectile. Something soft and heavy and deeply undignified, and it smelled faintly of overripe fruit. It struck her with enough force to stagger her forward 2 steps before she caught her footing, and she heard, underneath the thundering of her own pulse, a sound she had no adequate category for, not language, not exactly, something between a bark and a harmonic chord, with undertones that made the fillings in her back teeth ache. She stopped running, not because she wanted to, because her legs simply ceased cooperating, and she understood, with the calm clarity that sometimes arrives in the worst moments, that she had been caught. She turned around. The Voth stood perhaps 30 meters away, uphill from her on the bank. They came in pairs always, a behavioral pattern that xenobiologists had theorized about for a decade without reaching consensus. The leading theory was that it was a hunting adaptation, a predator reflex so deep in their evolutionary memory that they still defaulted to it even now, even in what they insisted was peacetime. The one in front was the larger of the two, its skin cycling through the amber to deep violet spectrum that indicated what Maren had been taught to recognize as focused attention. Its legs were jointed wrong, not grotesquely, not nightmarishly, just incorrectly, in the way that a sentence with the syntax rearranged was still technically a sentence. It stood at a height that forced you to look up slightly, which was, she suspected, not an accident. The second Voth held what it had thrown, another one, a banana. Maren looked at the banana in its long, pale fingers, and then she looked at the banana on the ground, near her feet, and she thought several things very quickly. She thought, this is a territorial marker. She had read about this. The Voth used food objects, specifically soft, highly scented fruit, as territorial boundary indicators. When dealing with species they considered were insufficiently intelligent to understand verbal communication, leaving or throwing food at an intruder was roughly a human posting a no trespassing sign, except the sign also implied you thought the trespasser was an animal. She thought, I am standing in their river zone, the zone they designated 6 months ago in the Accord, the one that Commander Reyes initialed without reading closely because she was trying to finish the negotiation before the winter storms closed the mountain passes. She thought, I came down here because Luca bet me 3 ration bars that I couldn't reach the Willow Bend and back before morning check. I came down here for 3 ration bars. Then she stopped thinking, because the larger Voth made the sound again. The bark chord, frequency that made dental work vibrate, and took 3 of its wrong-jointed steps toward her. And Maren Voss, age 14, the youngest resident of Accord Station Theta, the girl who had beaten out 32 other candidates for the junior liaison apprenticeship, the girl whose mother had died in the first incursion, so that humanity could be standing here having accords at all, did the only thing she could think to do. She picked up the banana, she peeled it, she ate it, she did not make eye contact. She sat down cross-legged in the gold-brown grass of the river zone, and she ate the banana with the deliberate, unhurried calm of someone who had been planning this all along. And she did not look at the Voth, and she did not run, and she did not cry, though the third one was a near thing. The Voth were still for a very long time. Then the larger one made a different sound. Lower. Something that the translation software would later render, inadequately, as accepted. They left. Marin sat in the grass for another 10 minutes before her legs would cooperate again. Then she walked. She absolutely did not run. Back up the bank, through the willows, across the bridge road, and into the compound perimeter. Luca was waiting at the gate, with the 3 ration bars, and an expression of someone who had not actually expected to pay up. She took the ration bars. She said nothing. She went to her bunk and lay on her back, and stared at the underside of the bunk above her and thought about the fact that she had apparently just successfully de-escalated a first contact boundary incident by eating a piece of fruit. She thought about this for a long time. Then she thought about her mother. 17 years later, Marin Voss sat in a chair that cost more than some people's homes, and told a room full of very important people that they were all wrong. She did not use those words. She was 31 now, and had learned to wrap the truth in enough diplomatic gauze that it didn't immediately cause bleeding. But the substance of what she said, stripped of the careful phrasing, was, "You are all wrong, and I have been watching you be wrong for 11 years. And if you do not stop being wrong in the next 90 days, we will lose everything that was bought with the lives of people who were significantly braver and better than anyone currently in this room." The room was the Accord Council chamber on Platform 6, which orbited at a comfortable remove from Earth and at a considerably less comfortable remove from the nearest Voth way station. The people in it were the 7 directors of the Human Continuance Initiative, 3 senior envoys, 2 military commanders, and a woman named Okafor, who had no official title and who Marin had learned, through patient observation, was the only person in the room worth talking to. The topic was the 59 Protocol. This was what they called it in the official documents, the 59 Protocol, named for the 59 days remaining before the Voth completed their survey of the outer solar system and returned to the negotiating table. 59 days in which humanity needed to demonstrate, in a way the Voth would find convincing, that humans were worth the continued trouble of peaceful engagement. The last 3 years had not gone well. There had been border violations, both sides. There had been a weapons test that humanity insisted was civilian research. There had been what the Voth called the Grassland Event, and what humans called the Theta Misunderstanding, was the same thing described from different vantage points, and which had resulted in 12 dead on the Hume side, and a Voth diplomatic drawl that had aged every member of this council visibly. What the council wanted, what they kept coming back to, in all their deliberations, was a show of force. A demonstration of capability sufficient to make the Voth calculate that aggression would cost them more than engagement. This was the logic of every arms race in human history, and every arms race in human history had eventually produced at least one catastrophic war. The Council found this observation unhelpful when Marin raised it. What Marin wanted was nothing else entirely. She wanted to send one person, one human being, no weapons, no fleet escort, no fanfare, into the Voth way station, carrying nothing, speaking directly to the collective witness, which was the Voth equivalent of a governing council, except that it also served, simultaneously, as a judicial body, a historical record, and something that had no clean human analog. A kind of living consensus that the Voth updated in real time as new information arrived. You did not address the collective witness with weapons. You addressed it by standing in front of it and being exactly what you were, because the collective witness would know the difference, and because the Voth had been observing humanity for 30 years and had concluded, based on evidence, Marin had spent 11 years painstakingly reconstructing from the diplomatic record, that the specific quality they found most difficult to categorize, and therefore most worthy of engagement, was not human strength, it was not human technology, it was not human aggression, which they found straightforward and dull. It was human willingness to be embarrassed. This was the thing. This was what the Theta incident had actually demonstrated, and what every subsequent incident had reinforced, The council could not see because they were looking for the wrong thing. The Voth did not respect power. Power was common. Every species with sufficient evolutionary pressure developed power. What the Voth had never encountered, in 37 documented first contact scenarios across 6 centuries of expansion, was a species that would willingly humiliate itself. That would sit down in the grass and eat the territorial marker, and thereby transform an act of dominance into an act of negotiation. That would sacrifice pride not as a tactic but as a reflex, because it was the right thing to do, because it was the human thing to do, because humans had some deeply strange relationship with dignity that meant they could discard it strategically while still somehow retaining it. The banana. That was what it always came back to. Marin had written 3 papers on the Theta incident. She had interviewed herself for 2 of them. Her colleagues, found professionally irregular. She had spent 11 years turning a 14-year-old girl's panic snack into a coherent theory of first contact diplomacy. And the theory was this: the Voth had been testing them from the beginning, not for strength, a specific kind of courage that looked, from the outside, like weakness. The council listened to all of this. Then Director Anais, who had the flat effect of someone who had spent too long making decisions about things he didn't fully understand, said, "You want to send one unarmed human into a Voth way station with no escort and no guarantee of return. The theory that they'll be impressed by the gesture." "Not the gesture," Marin said. "The person making it." "Which person?" Pause that lasted exactly as long as she needed it to. "Me," she said. "Shh." Was not a structure in any sense that translated cleanly to human architectural thinking. It did not have walls that contained interior space. It had boundaries that suggested interior space, which was a different thing. The Voth did not separate inside from outside the way humans did. They separated attended from unattended, which was a distinction that felt semantic until you were standing in it, at which point it felt like the most important distinction anyone had ever made. Marin stood in the attended space of the collective witness chamber and was very deliberately not having a panic attack. She had come alone. No translation device. She had the language now, 11 years of it, enough to be understood and to understand. Though the frequency still bothered her dental work. No weapons, obviously. No communicator. She had come in a shuttle that she'd piloted herself. Docked at the designated coordinates, the Voth had sent 6 hours after she filed her approach request. 6 hours in which the council had argued with her, threatened her, and finally signed the necessary release forms, when Okafor looked at each of them in turn and said nothing at all, which was apparently sufficient. The collective witness occupied the chamber the way weather occupied a valley. Not in a specific location within it, present throughout. There were individual Voth present, 7 of them, arranged not in a line or a circle but in a configuration that had a name in their language which translated roughly as the shape that asks a question. Their skin moved through colors she had learned to read. Amber meant attention. The deep violet beneath it meant something she didn't have a precise word for. Something between wariness and recognition. The color of an entity that has seen something before, and is not yet certain whether this instance is the same as the previous one. She stood in the center of the asking shape, and did not move and did not speak. This was intentional. She had thought carefully about how to begin, and what she had decided was, don't. Let them set the terms, let the silence sit. Humans were bad at silence. Humans filled silence with noise, because silence felt like failure, like nothing was happening. And humans were uncomfortable when nothing was happening. This was known. The Voth knew this. She was going to let them watch her be comfortable with nothing happening, and she was going to do it for as long as it took. It took 11 minutes. Then the Voth, at the point of the asking shape, the eldest by skin texture and movement pattern, produced a fruit from somewhere in the folds of its garment. Not a banana, something analogous. A pale ovoid thing that smelled of something sweet and organic and alien, and it held this out toward her, and the color of its skin shifted to a shade she had never seen in any of her study materials. She did not know what the shade meant. She knew what the gesture meant. She knew because she had been a 14-year-old girl sitting in the gold grass of a riverbank 17 years ago, and she had learned something then that no briefing document had ever been able to adequately capture, that the Voth communicated in actions more than in words, and that the specific action of offering food across a territorial boundary was not a test. It was the closest thing they had to a question. The question was, are you real? Not real in the physical sense. Real in the way that mattered. Present, genuine, here for actual reasons rather than performed ones. The territorial markers they threw were tests. The offered fruit was different. It was an invitation to confirm something they had already half-decided. The half-decided thing was, this one is real. Marin took the fruit. She looked at it for a moment. It was warm from wherever it had been stored. It weighed about what she expected. She thought about her mother, who had died at a border checkpoint in the first year of the incursion, not fighting, not fleeing, standing still with her hands open, trying to demonstrate something to an enemy that was not yet an adversary. It hadn't worked, that time. The timing had been wrong, and the communication had been incomplete, and the world had been different. The instinct had been right. The instinct was always right. It was the specifically human instinct that the Voth had been circling for 30 years without being able to name, the reflex that said, lower your guard first, go first, be vulnerable first. Not because it was safe, because someone had to, and because you were the one who understood that it had to be someone. She peeled the fruit. It peeled differently than a banana. More resistance, and a faint sound like tearing silk, and underneath the pale skin the flesh was the color of old honey. She broke a small piece off and held it in her palm toward the eldest Voth, not offering it exactly, just presenting it. Look, this is what I am doing, I am sharing this. This is what sharing looks like to us. The eldest looked at the piece of fruit in her palm for a long time. Then it made a sound. It was not the bark chord. It was not the frequency that bothered dental work. It was low and complex, and had harmonics she couldn't track, and it moved through the chamber, and she felt it more in her chest than her ears. And she did not know all of the words, but she knew enough of them, and the ones she knew resolved into something like, "We have been waiting to see if you would do that." Not this specific action. The type of action. The category of it. She ate her half. She let the moment breathe. Then she said in Voth, in the frequency she had spent 11 years learning to approximate, "We've been waiting to have the right conversation. Think we're close enough now to start." The color moved through the chamber. The amber of tension, the violet of something between wariness and recognition. And then something she had never seen in any of her materials. A warm, almost tidal gold that moved through each of the 7 Voth in sequence, one to the next, like a wave running from one end of the asking shape to the other. She did not know the word for that color. She suspected she was about to learn it. The council had expected her back in 6 hours. She was back in 4. She knew would alarm them in a different way than if she'd been late. A short meeting felt like failure. A short meeting felt like ejection. She let them work through this in real time as she walked into the chamber and took a seat without being invited to and said, "The collective witness has agreed to a full engagement framework. They'll send terms within 48 hours, which is significantly faster than any previous agreement. There are 3 conditions." Director Anes said, "What conditions?" "First, terms will be addressed to me, personally, not the council, not the initiative. Me. They consider me the relevant party to the negotiation." Silence. "Second, there will be a delegation exchange. 5 Voth to Platform 6, 5 humans to the way station. Full access, no restrictions. Each delegation will live with the other party for 30 days, not observe. Live." Another silence, longer. "Third condition," said Okafor, who was as the only person in the room whose face showed something other than institutional alarm. "They want the story," Marin said, "about the banana. Apparently it's become, I don't have a perfect translation for this, something like a teaching reference. In their educational materials, there's a version of it that circulates among their young. The actual Voth word is closer to a legend, but that's not quite right either. They want me to tell it correctly." The silence in the room was a specific texture she had not encountered before. "There's a Voth legend," Anais said carefully, "about a banana. About a child who sat in the grass," Marin said, "who chose something hard over something easy, found a way to make a territorial challenge into a greeting. The details they have are mostly right. They're missing a few things. She paused. They don't know she was terrified. They think it was calculated. Was it? Okafor asked. Marin thought about this seriously, the way she always had when someone asked her to be honest about a thing she'd half mythologizing for most of her adult life. I was 14, she said. I was running away from something I'd done for 3 ration bars, and I got caught, and I ate the banana because I couldn't think of anything else to do. The calculation came later. The terror was the whole thing. She looked around the room. That's what I'm going to tell them, she said, the terror version. Because I think that's the one that matters. The delegation exchange took 6 weeks to arrange from a logistics standpoint and approximately 4 months from a political one, because politics moved at the speed of institutional fear rather than the speed of actual events. In the intervening time, Marin wrote the account of the Theta incident as the Voth had requested. Not the paper version, not the diplomatic summary, but the version in which a 14-year-old girl was running for her life along a riverbank in the last gold weeks of a dying summer, and got caught, and did something embarrassing and necessary, and turned out to have been right. She wrote it in both languages. The Voth version took longer. She rewrote it 4 times before she felt the frequency was correct. The Voth read emotional states through linguistic frequency as readily as through the explicit content of words. And the specific frequency of honest admission was different from the frequency of performed humility, and she wanted to get it exactly right. When she delivered it to the collective witness, the eldest listened to the full account without interruption. When she finished, and then the gold title color she had seen in the chamber months ago moved through the eldest's skin again, slowly shore to shore. She had learned the word for it by then. The word was something like verified. It was the color the Voth displayed when something they had hoped to be true turned out to actually be true. When the shape of a thing in the distance finally resolved into the thing they had believed it was. And the belief and the reality matched. When the bet you placed on another species' fundamental character had paid out. Verified. The collective witness had believed for 17 years that a child had sat in the grass and eaten their territorial marker, not out of strategy and not out of submission, but out of the particular human combination of desperation and decency that added up to something that had no name in Voth. And now the child, adult now 31, sitting in the tended space of the chamber with honey gold fruit juice, still faint on her fingers, had affirmed it. They were real. The night before the delegation exchange, Marin walked to the observation deck of Platform 6 and stood at the railing with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago and looked at the star field. Somewhere in it, arrayed in the configuration that Voth navigators called the current agreement, their name for a pattern of navigation beacons that were also, in their system of meaning, a kind of public record, were the way stations, dozens of them. 37 documented first contact scenarios across 6 centuries, and humanity was still here, still in the table stakes of this very long and very dangerous game. Luca found her there. He still worked at Accord Station Theta, running supply logistics, a career that suited his disposition in a way that the junior liaison track had never quite suited him. He had come up to Platform 6 for the delegation ceremony and had spent 2 days being visibly uncomfortable with all the gravity, metaphorical and literal. He stood next to her at the railing and looked at the same star field and said nothing for a while, which was something he had gotten better at over the years. 3 ration bars, he said eventually. 3 ration bars, she agreed. Worth it? She thought about her mother's hands open at a border checkpoint. She thought about gold grass and cold air and the smell of overripe fruit. She thought about the color that meant verified. And the way it moved through 7 Voth, in sequence like a wave finding its shore, and the weight of a warm alien fruit in her palm. And 31 years of being the specific kind of human that she had turned out, accidentally and necessarily, to be. Ask me again in 50 years, she said, when we know how it ends. He leaned on the railing beside her. How do you think it ends? She looked at the star field, all those lights, all that distance, all the ways humans had found across all of history, close gaps that seemed unbridgeable, not through force, not through genius, through the specific stubbornness of a species that would sit down in the enemy's grass and eat the enemy's fruit. and refused to be diminished, but the reflex to survive. That would go first. That would be embarrassed first. That would be terrified first. And then, in the silence after the terror, in the long breath between the running and the stopping, figure out that the terror was the whole thing, and work with what they had. I think it ends with us still being strange enough to be interesting, she said. That's the best-case scenario. We stay strange. Behind them, through the deck windows, the lights of Platform 6 hummed with the low, constant labor of a civilization that had survived its own worst instincts, just enough times to still be here. The delegation would arrive in the morning. There were rooms prepared. There were protocols drafted. There were 30 days of actual living, side by side, across whatever distances of biology and history and mutual misunderstanding still separated them. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. It was a child in the grass, and a piece of fruit, and the strange human gift for choosing the hard and embarrassing and necessary thing, the gift they hadn't known they had, until someone threw a banana at them, and they had to decide. In the space of one panicked heartbeat, they were going to be. The stars kept burning. The coffee stayed cold. Marin stood at the railing and did not run. She never had been good at it anyway. The 5 Voth who came to Platform 6 were called, in the approximate phonetic rendering that the translation team used for internal communications, the listeners. This was not their actual designation. Their actual designation was a frequency complex that required 3 overlapping vocal structures to produce and that had no meaningful human analog. The listeners was what the junior staff called them, because it was what they did, constantly and unervingly, their secondary sensory structures angled forward, in permanent receptive posture. They listened. They gathered. They processed the ambient data of human civilization 24 hours a day with the patient. Unblinking attention of something that had been waiting a very long time to finally hear this particular frequency. They made the junior staff deeply uncomfortable. They made the senior staff more professionally uncomfortable, presented differently, but stemmed from the same source. You could see them being evaluated. You could feel it, the way you feel observed through glass. When there is something on the other side that is intelligent and watching and making conclusions, the Voth did not hide their assessment of what they saw. Their skin color shifted with every new stimulus, reading like a text you couldn't translate fast enough to keep up with. Marin had arranged their quarters in the residential section of Platform 6's south wing, the part farthest from the operational core. This had been the Council's suggestion: keep them away from anything sensitive. Marin had agreed for different reasons. The south wing had windows, large ones, curved with the station's hull, that looked directly out at the star field. She had noticed, in her time at the way station, that the Voth oriented themselves toward openness. They didn't like enclosed spaces the way humans sometimes found enclosed spaces cozy. They liked to see a long distance. They liked the feeling of horizon, even a stellar one. On the second day, she found the eldest of the 5. Designated listener prime for internal record purposes. Vifeth had not objected to when informed of it. Standing at the largest window in the south wing's common area, just standing. Still, its skin in the amber violet of focused attention, angled toward the star field, with the complete absorption of someone reading a book they have been waiting years to find. She stood beside it. She looked at the same stars. We call it the Milky Way, she said in Voth. The whole of it. The shape you see. Humans have had many names for it. The oldest ones are about rivers and roads and paths of something spilled across the sky. She paused. Milk is what we feed our young when they're born, before they can manage anything else. Perhaps. The listener prime turned its secondary sensory structures toward her. The amber deepened. You name the sky for the substance you use to keep your young alive, it said. Its frequency for this statement was the one she had come to recognize as neither question nor declaration. Something in between, an observation offered outward to see what it would collect. Yes, she said. A pause. We name our sky. The listener prime said. For the sound it made, the first time one of ours looked up and understood it was large. Marin stood with that for a moment. She thought about what it would mean to hear the sky rather than see it, and about the specific moment of understanding largeness, and about how a species named the things that broke them open in awe. What was the sound? She asked. The listener prime produced the frequency. It was brief, 4 seconds, maybe 5, and it was not beautiful by any human musical measure, but it was vast. It had depth that seemed inconsistent with the space available to produce it. It moved through her chest, the same way the collective witness had moved through the chamber at the way station. And she understood suddenly, in a way that bypassed language entirely, exactly what it meant to hear something so large that the only response available was to name it. The skin of the listener prime shifted into the gold title color. Verified. It had wanted to know whether she would understand, and she had, and now they both knew it. The human delegation to the way station was led, at their own insistence, by a man named Corporal Thiago Bauer, which represented a small victory for Marin and a large source of institutional anxiety for the council. Bauer was not a diplomat. He was 26 years old and had spent 3 years as a perimeter security officer at Accord Station Theta, where he had developed a reputation for 2 things: exceptional situational awareness and an absolute refusal to pretend he understood things he didn't understand. This second quality was the one Marin had selected him for. She had spent 11 years observing the patterns that produced successful human-Voth interaction, and what she had found, consistently, was that the humans who did best were not the most intelligent, or the most experienced, or the most credentialed. They were the ones who were most comfortable being genuinely uncertain, who could stand in the middle of something they didn't understand and say so, without performing distress about it. The Voth, she had come to believe, with the careful certainty of someone who has spent a very long time being almost sure, found authentic uncertainty more legible than performed confidence. Performed confidence read in their sensory register as noise, genuine uncertainty read as signal. Bauer had said when she briefed him, "I don't really understand why you're sending me," she had said. "That's exactly why." He had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone trying to determine whether they were being played. Then he had said, "Okay, flat acceptance of a person who has decided to trust a process they can't fully see, and that was that." She had briefed him carefully on the things that mattered most. Don't gesture with your hands near your face. It read, as threat assessment to Voth. Don't speak quickly when you don't know what to say. Silence was preferable to velocity. If they offer you food, take it. Don't think about what it is, just take it. He had asked. What if I don't like it? She had said, eat it anyway. He had made the face of someone filing this under things I do for the species and moved on. Report that came back from the way station at the end of the 30 days was not what the council expected. They had expected data, observations, assessments, tactical impressions of Voth infrastructure and capacity. What Bauer submitted was 40 pages of personal account that read less like a military report and more like a letter from someone who had gone very far from home and come back changed. He had, in his words, spent 30 days being watched and watching back, and had eventually stopped trying to make sense of everything he saw and had just started being there, he wrote. On day 12 I gave up trying to catalog what I didn't understand, and just started sitting with it. That seemed to be the right move. The Voth around me changed when I did that. The colors changed, he wrote. Day 19 one of them showed me how it navigates. I don't mean it explained the navigation system. I mean it took me to where the navigation happens, and stood with me while I looked at it and let me take the time I needed to understand it even, though I mostly didn't. And then it made a sound and I didn't know what the sound meant, but it felt like patience. It felt like it was saying, this is okay, we have time. He wrote, at the end, I don't know if I did this right. I mostly felt like I was getting it wrong. But they kept including me in things, and I kept showing up, and I think maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is just to keep showing up and be honest about what you don't know. I don't know. Maybe ask Dr. Voss. Marin read this report 3 times. Then she filed it under legacy documents in the Accord archive, which was the category reserved for materials. That said something essential and irreducible about what humans were. The terms the collective witness sent, 46 hours after Marin's visit, were not what the council expected either. They had expected resource partitions, military exclusion zones, technology sharing frameworks, the architectural elements of every interstellar accord humanity had previously negotiated. They got those eventually in the later annexes. But the preamble, the statement of intent that the Voth placed at the front of every agreement they entered, part that said what the agreement was actually about underneath the specifics, was something that no one on the council had anticipated. Preamble said, in a translation, that Marin checked 4 times because she wanted to be sure she was reading it correctly. This agreement begins at a riverbank in the last days of a dying summer, with a child who did not run. Not. This agreement begins on the date of signing. Not. This agreement begins at the point of first verified contact. At a riverbank, with a child, in the dying summer. The Voth had been dating the relationship from that moment for 17 years. In their formal record, the part of the collective witness that constituted legal and historical reality, the human Voth engagement had not begun. First contact, or with the accord, or with any of the official ceremonies that humanity had marked as significant. It had begun the moment a 14-year-old girl sat down in the grass and chose a specific kind of courage that the Voth had been cataloging for 6 centuries without ever seeing before. When Marin read this, she sat quietly for a very long time. Then she called her brother, who was a school teacher in what remained of the city where their mother had been born, and told him, he said. Mum would have found that hilarious, Marin said. Mum would have found it mortifying. They were both right. They stayed on the line for a while without saying much. From the model silence of people who have known each other long enough that silence is a language, too. The delegation exchange ended on a Tuesday in late autumn, when the light came through Platform 6's south wing windows, at a low angle, and turned everything it touched the specific gold that Marin had been carrying in her memory for 17 years. The 5 listeners assembled in the common area for departure with the methodical, unhurried quality of beings who understood time differently than humans did. Not as something running out, but as something moving through, the way a river moved through a landscape and changed it and moved on. Marin walked them to the docking bay. At the door of the docking corridor, the listener prime stopped. It turned to her. Its skin was in the amber of attention, and underneath it, steady and warm, the gold of verified. The color she had not had a word for the first time she saw it, and now did. It produced a fruit from the folds of its garment. The pale void, honey sweet, warm from wherever it had been kept. It held it out to her. She took it. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, thinking about all the weight it carried. Then she produced, from the pocket of her jacket, a banana. She had been carrying it for 2 days, because she'd had a feeling about this moment, and she handed it to the listener prime, and it took it, and they stood for a moment at the threshold between one world and another, each holding the other's fruit. Was not a metaphor, and was entirely a metaphor, and was mostly just 2 beings from very different places deciding to be real with each other. The listener prime made the low, chest-resonant sound that the translation software continued to render inadequately. In the frequency Marin heard, "We are close enough now." In the full harmonics she was still learning to read, and we were so close before, and we are grateful for the distance that remained, because crossing it together is what made this real. She said in Voth, "Thank you for coming." It said in Voth, "Thank you for sitting down." It walked through the door. The other 4 followed. The docking bay sealed, and the shuttle disconnected, and Marin stood at the viewport and watched it drop away from Platform 6 into the starfield and navigate toward the configuration of lights that the Voth called the current agreement. She stood there until she couldn't see it anymore. Then she took the fruit from her pocket and peeled it and ate it, right there at the viewport, in the low autumn light, alone, while the stars burned and the distance between one species and another grew exactly as small as they had chosen to make it. The fruit was honey gold and sweet, and she did not know its name. She would learn it. She had time.